we'll kind of see how we go.
Yeah, we're gonna play it here, but we might have a Q&A after Sunday's class. But any questions? Oh, question and answer, like you can ask questions about anything.
If we finish the class a little bit early, because it's meant to go till 3, so I was just thinking in the afternoon, kind of depending on how we go, because a couple of people said it would be nice to just have time to ask very general questions about Buddhism, or maybe some questions about what people have been reading. So I don't want to promise this early, because we haven't even started the class yet, and we just have no idea what's going to happen. I mean, I have a little bit of a plan, but not really any idea. So we'll see, but possibly, yeah. No, go ahead.
But no, that's really, I just wanted to give people the lowdown so that, we can have a smooth flow for offerings after the class. And thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Annette. All right, so what I thought we could do tonight, since we kind of got carried away with a little bit of discussion yesterday and didn't have time to do a meditation, and I wanted to introduce this practice, and we'll just begin with this, and then we'll kind of review a little bit what we did last night, and then carry on from there. And it's a practice that is really, really helpful when we're feeling kind of overwhelmed by emotional experience in a way that we think it might lead to maybe a destructive, outcome, some sort of a destructive emotional behavior. And it sort of relates to the story I said last night about, kind of what I went through in my own experience of feeling a strong emotion, trying to really sit with it, recognize what was going on. And sometimes you notice that the emotion kind of unravels itself. There's plenty of antidotes for all of the specific emotions in Buddhism, but this is sort of, I sometimes introduce this as a bit of a sort of a one-size-fits-all meditation that we can use for our emotional experience. And so I'll just kind of introduce you to the points and then lead you through it as a guided meditation. We'll begin with that. And the first, it's a nice acronym, RAIN, easy to remember. This meditation was developed by a Vipassana teacher called Michelle McDonald Smith. And there's another teacher, Tara Brach, who some of you might have heard of. She's written many books. And she also teaches this meditation technique a lot. There's a lot of articles online if you just want to Google, rain, probably along with meditation, or else you'll get the weather report, like rain meditation or rain Tara Brach or something like that. Some of these articles will come up online and you can read a little bit more out of them. Very simple, but very, very powerful, kind of simple to do, but very profound. And the first step is recognize what's happening. So the first part is recognition, recognizing that you're feeling emotional. Sometimes part of the recognition is we notice there's sensations in our body. So a lot of times the first signal to when we're feeling emotional is sensations in our body. Oh, my stomach feels really tight, my hands are sweaty, some physiological response. So just kind of recognizing what's going on. And then the second part, just allowing that emotion to be. And this is something that often, I think, for people who are trained in Tibetan Buddhism especially, is difficult, because we're told, quick, apply the antidote without wasting even a second, when you're feeling an emotion that could be destructive. But often we just don't have enough information yet if we just allow ourselves to feel whatever it's feeling. And this goes back to kind of Paul Ekman's work in the Western psychological view. Emotions have a function. They have information for us. They're trying to tell us something, and we're not going to get the message. And it can easily be suppression if we immediately try and make it go away. So the allowing is a really important piece, I think. And then often, as I mentioned last night, with anger, for example, many emotions, and I think anger is a perfect example, can sometimes be a secondary emotion. And what's more fundamental is maybe fear, maybe hurt feelings. I think it's like the theme is some kind of vulnerability. And remember, we talked about the theme of anger is to remove an obstacle. And I remember when I was studying Cultivating Emotional Balance, I asked Eve Ekman, who was our teacher trainer, and I said, well, when anger is a secondary emotion, to another more fundamental one, how does that fit with the theme of anger being to remove an obstacle? And she goes, the obstacle is vulnerability. We're trying to remove the obstacle of how, exposed we feel when we feel some kind of vulnerability, whether it's fear, whether it's hurt feelings or, and so we're going to anger because it's easier to feel anger than it is to feel vulnerability. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. And I find that not every episode of anger, but often I find it can be really helpful through sometimes just the first two steps, the R and the A. And then you realize what's going on and the whole thing just sort of unravels itself. And then the I, investigate inner experience with a caring presence. And when Michelle McDonald Smith first sort of developed this technique, she found that a lot of people, when they were doing the investigation, she didn't talk about the caring presence and with love and self-love and friendliness. And she found that with the investigation, people were kind of beating themselves up. They were finding, and we talked about that perception database in that emotional episode timeline, discovering some things that might be in there, maybe from childhood that make things quite triggering. That's part of the investigation. And then sometimes when that happens, we can beat ourselves up, like, oh, my stuff, I've got all this stuff. It's just, when we actually see it, often we can really, get kind of angry at ourselves for having those triggering data points or whatever it might be. So the caring presence is really important there. But in the investigation, when we looked at that emotional episode timeline, we can see, using that, we can really investigate what's going on. Is there an underlying narrative going on? Is there some storyline? And some of you were here last weekend when we did the Karma course, and we did a selflessness meditation where we kind of looked at our story of me and said, where does that come from? What's the storyline? Is that valid? So all of those things can be part of the investigation. And then non-identification. And this is important to say, it's not who I am. This emotion is not me, because a lot of times when we're feeling strongly emotional, we can identify so strongly with that emotion. Even our language in English is weird because we use the verb to be. I am angry. I am sad. A lot of other European languages use the verb to have. I have anger. I have fear. Other languages, I'm not quite sure, but it's like even in the verb that we use, there's a strong identification of ourselves with the emotion. And, to say, it's passing, it's a thought, it's an event that's happening to me right now. It's this physiology and this like psychological components, but it's not who I am. And just to create some spaciousness around it. So that's kind of what we do. So we're going to do this together, and then we'll just see if there's any questions. I'll guide you through. We'll recall an emotional episode in the very beginning, and I'll ask you to recall it so that you feel the emotion again. So I ask you, do not pick the most triggering, heavy emotion. We don't want a room full of highly triggered people. I don't want to be responsible for that. And it's a little bit like saying, don't think about a pink elephant, because the minute I tell you, don't pick the worst incident in your, in your life, that's what you're thinking of. But maybe medium. Let's go for medium triggering episode from your memory. And then we'll just kind of see, re-trigger ourselves a little bit with the memory, and then feel the feelings in our body, and then go through the steps and see how it goes. Okay? So let's start off by just getting in a comfortable posture, comfortable alert posture with your back straight. your shoulders even. And we'll start by just focusing on the breath for a few minutes to settle the mind, focusing on the sensations of the breath in the body. It might be that you feel the sensations in the abdomen, perhaps in the chest with the lungs expanding and contracting, and perhaps you feel the sensations in the nostrils, wherever in the body you feel the sensations of the emotion. Just focus there. When you get distracted by a thought or a sense impression, anything that pulls you away from the present moment, just release the distraction and return to the breath. This is a way of getting ourselves here in this room, in the present moment, ready for our meditation. And now recall an emotional trigger that you'd like to spend time on, like to bring more attention to. Maybe something that's left you with a regrettable feeling and that might distance you from others after the emotion has passed. So try not to pick something that's too traumatic, but some kind of an emotional trigger that you'd like to bring some awareness to. And bring to mind a specific instance where this emotional trigger made you feel contracted and stuck in an emotional experience. And so through your imagination, through your memory, begin to picture or feel yourself in that situation. If the situation involved another person, imagine their face or their voice or their behavior that triggered you. And if you're by yourself, bring to mind the thoughts or memories that triggered you and draw from your memory, bring up that recollection until you feel yourself getting slightly triggered into that emotional state again. And become aware of the emotional experience and recognize what's happening right now. If it's helpful, you can name the emotion that's present. Recognize the emotion. What does it feel like in your body? Are there accompanying thoughts that go along with that emotional experience? And then as you're feeling this emotional experience, what it feels like in your body, the thoughts and memories that are coming up, keep an intention to just allow the emotional experience to be here. It sometimes feels uncomfortable to be having these emotional experiences. We don't want to be feeling them, but just allow. Create space for that emotional experience without pushing it away, without aversion. And then with a caring presence, gently begin to investigate. Is there any underlying belief connected to that emotion? Maybe an idea of not being able to trust others, or I'm not good enough, I'm going to fail. Is there any kind of underlying narrative, storyline? And don't try to think your way through too analytically. Just wait and see if anything comes up. Is there some reason that this event is especially triggering due to some narrative or story or belief associated with that experience? And if you do notice something come up, just investigate with a caring presence. And in order to symbolize that caring presence, you might want to bring your hands to your heart, just to symbolize that you're holding yourself through this experience with a caring presence. The heartfelt concern of kindness. And notice these thoughts and sensations from the quiet space of awareness, without becoming stuck inside them, just watch that experience naturally arise and pass. So don't identify. These are just thoughts, sensations, feelings that arise and then pass away. So notice this process. Okay. Any questions about that practice or any experiences that came up? So yeah, very.
All my experiences, little brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts tried to come in as well. So I had to say no, I'm just focusing on this one. So that was a challenge.
Yeah, so not to get it complicated with a lot of other sort of storyline and complicated, but yeah, it can be, Lynn, like I said, even just the first two steps can sometimes really sort of unravel things as you just allow these emotions, because usually when we have anything that's unpleasant to experience, it's like quick, anything but that, and nowadays we have all these luminous rectangles. We can distract ourselves even more than we ever could. Before, it used to be you'd have to call up a friend and go out for coffee. Now all you have to do is like pick up your device, pick up your devices. You get so distracted, and just watching how we do that to distract ourselves from unpleasant feelings. And it's really hard to say, I'm just going to sit there and allow this thing that doesn't feel good. But that's when it can speak to you and give you the information, because all of these emotions have information for you. And I always feel like they're kind of like I don't have children in this life, but I've been around them enough to know, like the 4-year-old trying to get your attention in the grocery store, and it's like, you're not paying attention. They're like, mommy, 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 daddy, mommy, daddy. And then they just keep pulling harder and harder, and our emotions are like that too. If we don't pay attention to them, they just get louder and louder and much more obnoxious. So it's like really paying attention. And then sometimes the insights, I have a story I often tell that some of you may have heard me tell when I was here before, about one experience in prison, doing a similar meditation with prison inmates before I really knew about rain. But it's the same thing, like sit with the uncomfortable feeling and just kind of be with it. And this one inmate who had such anger issues. I mean, he would always come in with like a broken nose and a black eye. And, I don't even know why he was in prison, but there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever it had something to do with anger. And nobody even wanted to sit near him. And he just had this belligerent look on his face all the time. And like, yeah, okay, whatever, And then he did this meditation and he realized he was full of fear. And all of his anger came from this incredible lifelong fear. And he never knew that it was fear underlying it. And it was just this huge epiphany for this guy. And he completely transformed. I mean, even his face totally transformed. He started looking like a little boy, like sitting in the front of the class, being all, instead of, he used to sit in the back and just like, and it's like, yeah, right. Give it your best shot. Like, I'm bigger than you and I have tattoos too, okay? So like, go ahead, make my day, like whatever. But then he just completely transformed, and it was just so awesome. You know, it was really, really amazing. And one of the guys that had been in prison with him for like 15 years or something wrote me a letter and said, I never in a million years would have thought that that would have happened. And it was just that he sat with all this turmoil enough to get that it was really fear, you know, instead of just what was he always doing? It was just popping off and hitting somebody in the face. Like the minute he'd feel anything uncomfortable, it would just be like, brah, you know, and he'd never just kind of hung out with it. So for us, it's mostly less dramatic than that, but can be just as profound of an insight of like, just sit there and get what the emotion is trying to tell you. And that's why in Cultivating Emotional Balance, we spend a lot of time looking at the function of the 7 universal emotions, because they all really do have, you know, a necessary function. And then that leads us to what I want to talk about next, which is to look at anger. Again, we ended up last night talking about anger, but we didn't quite finish, and I wanted to look at 4 steps for working with anger. Because remember, we said that the theme for anger is removing some kind of an obstacle. And so it's good information. You know, we have this emotion because it's giving us some kind of information, but the whole point is not to enact it in a destructive way. So how can we maybe work with our anger in a more constructive way? So identifying the stimulus without confusing it with our evaluation, right? So this is like what really is, you know, triggering that anger, not my story about what it is, and not my evaluation, and not my whole thing of it's so unfair, or, you know, it shouldn't be happening, or why are they doing this to me? But just, you know, straight up, what's the stimulus of the anger? And then identify the internal image, the judgment, the projection, or storyline that's making us angry. And so we were talking a little bit last night about expectations and how much our anger really comes from an expectation around a situation. We think it's the situation that's making us angry, but it's really that the situation isn't working out the way we expected it to work out. You know, there's so many things that we're superimposing onto that situation, something, some kind of narrative, some kind of storyline. So if we can get clear about this, and this is sort of the investigation step of the rain, if we're doing it in meditation practice, is really identifying what's going on and then transforming into a need that's being expressed. And so there's some kind of a need there. If we can get down to what basic need do we have? We have a whole story of how things should be. We have all these judgments about the event and the situation, but really stripping all of that away and getting down to a basic need. And then can we get that need met somehow? Can we express that somehow in a way that's very constructive? And so I think, you know, again, when we look at, I mean, this is if another person is involved. Usually if our anger is destructive, I mean, we can go out and like break windows of, you know, cars or something like Beyonce in the Lemonade video. You know, we can do that if we feel angry, but it's usually some other person that our anger is directed to. And so it's about, you know, getting clear about our need, stripping away all of that projection and judgment, and then is there a way that we can express somehow clearly our need? And I mentioned last night this kind of modality called nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, nonviolent communication. And it's really all about this, you know, can we clearly make a request around a situation without blaming the other person, you know, stripping away all that expectation, but just really kind of identify it as, you know, with I statements, this is my need and this is my request. So these are some of the ways that we work with anger. One of the other ways, and we talked about this the other day too, and I can't remember which day or which evening it was, and Annette was saying how she noticed often people can be triggering if they're mirroring something that we don't like about ourselves. And so I think there's other ways we can work with anger. And I found this super helpful for myself is just, if I find something, especially if it's the kind of anger that's just annoyance and irritation, like that level of anger, or just like, oh God, this person's so annoying. Looking at what is it about their behavior that is really like mirroring something in me that I'm rejecting, and 100% of the time, it's true. And then the solution is accept that quality in yourself. Like find some gift of that quality in yourself and then accept it. And then suddenly all the annoying people just disappear. I mean, it's kind of magic that way. But how much people push our buttons if they're sort of mirroring, kind of some quality in us that we're rejecting. So there's different ways of really dealing with anger, but I think the expectation part, like check your expectations, check how much that person is a mirror for you. Do you have some story about this situation that you're, so upset that things aren't going according to your agenda about this situation? Those are some ways of working it that can be really, really helpful, I think. So any questions about this? Wait, yes?
Are you saying that if there's something that annoys me intensely about someone, I have that trait in myself that I don't like?
I found that to be really true. I found that to be like a big breakthrough I did this when I think it was last weekend I mentioned this. I was in this long meditation retreat, and at one point, because when you're in solitude in a yurt in the middle of the desert in Arizona for years, you can get really obsessive about things, even more than my normal tendency, which is already pretty. At one point, I made a list of all the people I found the most annoying, and then whatever quality about them was the most annoying quality. It was all the same two qualities. And then it was like, oh my God. It was just like holding a mirror up. And I said, wow, like it's extreme, right? People that have qualities that I don't have, I'm not really reacting to very much. So I found that to be true in my own experience. And then when I worked at relabeling, I sort of reframed those qualities that I was rejecting in myself. And it was a quality I associated with one of my parents. And one of my favorite writers once said, you spend your entire adult life trying not to be one of your parents. That's our big agenda. And so I think because I identified those qualities with the parent I was trying so hard not to be like, and then when I saw them anywhere, in me or out there or anywhere, but then I reframed those qualities and saw, okay, it's also a gift. I can look at that as a strength. And sometimes the same quality is our biggest obstacle and our biggest strength at the same time. It just depends on how are we looking at it. So I found that to be super helpful. When people are pushing my buttons, just really look at that and just go, wow, is it really me? I'm just rejecting that thing in myself. And then whenever I see it mirrored out there, it just pushes my buttons. So I found that to be really, really helpful. Make a list. It becomes so clear. When it happens one by one, sometimes it's not so clear, but if you could be obsessive like I did and put it all down on a piece of paper, it's kind of shocking and embarrassing. You don't have to show your list to anyone. It's like too embarrassing, because it really is. Yeah, I found that to be super helpful. Yeah. Anything else? Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, Chris.
What if it's like a very dark feeling, like, I'm not gonna go kill anybody, but if it's something like, you're so angry at someone, how do you accept that? How do you
Yeah. So it's sort of, well, I think almost the heavier it is, I think those really, really heavy ones really are due to some kind of vulnerability. I think when they're that extreme, it's almost always triggered by, because otherwise if it's just removing some obstacle, it wouldn't be that deep. So I think in that case, protect yourself and protect other people. obviously, like if it just feels like too much, you might want to get some support going through this process. If it really, really feels like, oh my God, it's so overwhelming, I don't know if I can deal with it. Because sometimes we don't want to go, like that's why I said in this meditation, don't think of the worst triggering thing. And I think if there are things that are really heavy like that, it's good to get some kind of support around the process of sort of unraveling and unearthing. Because sometimes maybe we unearth something and it was some like early trauma that's just, we need help, we need support, So if it really, really does feel extreme like that, good to get some support around that, either from a therapist or some group or, something like that, I think. And don't go there alone. It can be too heavy. It can be quite overwhelming. And then I think sometimes, you kind of feel a despair of like, oh, it's so deep, I'll never get over it. And you need support around that too, So I think, again, for this, it's like helpful. And like I was saying to somebody, I think during the break yesterday, if you really have, a lot of trauma, I mean, meditation can be super helpful. And I think it's really good to couple it with therapeutic techniques, especially if there is like deep traumas and things that you're trying to unearth, or something that you just feel a little bit lost in. What can I do? I mean, I'm a big believer in a lot of, therapeutic methods kind of coupled with meditation. Sometimes people come to these retreat centers. I mean, I've had this happen at retreat centers that I've lived and worked, and they think meditation's going to fix everything. I've had people go off their meds, and we've had to call 911 and get them transported to the nearest like psychiatric, so it's sort of like, we need to know, when is meditation going to help? When do we need the big guns to help, with some, or even if it's not like the big guns, but just some support around it, some emotional support. So I think that's important. Yeah, don't try and go to those super dark places by yourself. It's too scary. Have somebody whose hand you can hold. Yeah. Anything else about that? All right, so let's look a little bit, wanted to look at more about how we can apply some awareness to the emotional episode timeline, that timeline we've been working with, when we're feeling emotional before we act. So this kind of comes near the end of the timeline, right before the behavior. Just really checking and asking yourself, is that behavior, what you're going to say or what you're going to do, is it helpful to me, to other people, kind of to the world at large, to the situation at large? So trying to kind of check yourself. Remember, we had that part after the emotion, before the either constructive or destructive behavior. Hard sometimes to pause. Sometimes we just act and react without thinking at all. But if we can stop and just sort of check ourselves a little bit and just say, okay, is this beneficial? Is this going to be constructive, what I'm planning to say or do? And often the answer is no. And then, like I said before, walk away, get out of the situation if you're feeling so triggered that you feel like, if I stay here, I'm not going to be able to not do or say something. I told the story last week about my friend who at Thanksgiving dinner just got up in the middle of dinner when his sister said that thing that pushed his buttons, and he knows he's going to yell at her if he's there for 5 more seconds, and he just got up and left and drove away. Totally valid technique. Do it. Do a 180. Get out of Dodge. Just don't say or do something stupid that might lead to long-lasting repercussions. And then when we've really got things that are what we call hot triggers, ones that really, really can trigger our destructive episodes, keeping a log of those regrettable emotional episodes. So you can do the whole timeline with them. You can just sort of look at the trigger, the behavior, what was regrettable, what was destructive about that. And then when you've got a couple of entries, about 10 or 15 entries, then you can see some patterns, right? If we're just reacting to them one by one, sometimes the pattern isn't clear. But often the pattern becomes really, really clear if we keep some kind of a log, like, oh, whenever I say that thing that hurts somebody's feelings, what's going on there? And then you can kind of investigate a little bit. Why is that triggering for you? So it's really helpful to keep a log. I mean, it kind of can feel daunting in the beginning because you can just go, oh my God, I don't even want to think about it again. I definitely don't want to write it down and all these steps, but it really can be helpful for bringing awareness to that emotional episode timeline and really seeing what some of those underlying themes are. And so in that way, you might be able to recognize in advance situations that are likely to be triggering. Sometimes we just avoid them until we're stronger, until we've got, more ability to manage our emotions, or at least you can prepare for them ahead of time. You can go, oh, like my student with Thanksgiving dinner. Every year it's triggering. So either he decides to tell his, I think the next year he told his family he was doing a meditation retreat. And then he did it so he wouldn't be lying, because it would have been kind of uncool to mix lying with avoiding Thanksgiving. So anyway, he did it until he was kind of ready, that then his sister, like he was working on, why is it that what my older sister says in that patronizing voice? So meanwhile, he's working on that to kind of prepare himself for that. But the next year he was like, I just got to skip it. I'm just not even going to put myself in that situation. So we say that's different from just denial and avoidance. It's like avoiding in the short term until you've got some skills so that you don't do something regrettable. That's kind of what it's like. And in the Buddhist teachings, we say it's like when you plant a little sapling. While it's still kind of tender and new, you protect it, you put a deer fence around it, you kind of wrap, rabbit-proof tape around the bark. Later on, when it's big and strong, you don't have to do any of that stuff. And our minds is like that too. Later on, we'll have that resilience, we'll have that capacity, we'll have the skills, we'll have retrained ourselves. But in the short term, sometimes we need to protect ourselves, our minds, our own behavior, and our own situation. We can rehearse alternative behavior. And by the way, that's what our meditation practice is rehearsal for the other 23 and a half hours of the day. So one of the things that can be really, really helpful to do is replay, kind of like we did with the rain, replay those scenarios that tend to be re-triggering and habituate yourself in the safety of your meditation cushion to different ways of reacting, so that then your habitual response will be really different. If you try and change everything in the moment when that experience is happening, that's hard. You can't always do it. But if you rehearse, and in fact, the Tibetan word for meditation is gom, which comes from a root that means to habituate. So even in our Buddhist meditation, when we're doing loving kindness meditation, compassion meditation, we're habituating our minds to these different things. And we can take real life examples onto the meditation cushion and rehearse a different way of reacting, so that then that'll be second nature instead of the regrettable behavior. We can remind ourselves to reappraise the trigger. And remember, we said with emotions, we have this automatic appraisal. Question, is that really valid? It may not be. And remember last week for those of you that were here, I gave an example of a client of Paul Ekman's who, when he was a little boy, like 4 or 5 years old, his father used to tease him mercilessly in this really humiliating way. And so for him, teasing was always triggered this angry response because he felt like it was always linked with humiliation. And then he's just at work and his coworkers are just doing what coworkers do and kind of teasing him. And then he'd just go ballistic every time. And then he had to reappraise and say, they don't mean to humiliate me. I'm appraising that trigger wrongly, right? My coworkers they're trying to bond with me and we're joshing around and it's no big deal, right? So he had to change that appraisal that was so linked in his mind to humiliation. So we can reappraise, disable the trigger by removing those projections that distort the view, right? That's a way of kind of reappraising or disabling. And then in close relationships, once we know what our hot triggers are, we can communicate about the need for a wise break. And we talked about that last night. Really communicating, don't just storm off and slam the door and get into your car and drive away. You know, your intimate partner, that's just going to be another triggering event. But we say, okay, you know, I need a time out right now. I'll be back in 2 hours and we'll talk about it. And then negotiating, if it feels like you need more time after that, negotiating to come back, right? So it's just really about doing it in a way that's wise. Because remember, we said in that emotional episode timeline, we've got that selective filtering period. And when we're in the middle of that, there's really nothing we can do. All the data coming in is just going to reinforce that emotion that we had. So these are some of the ways of working with some of those hot triggers. So any questions about that? Yeah,
Do
Marianne.
you feel like the wise break is coping out versus, when
Yeah.
the training wheels can come off, no, I'm okay enough to actually
Yeah.
face the situation, because it's so much easier it's like
To
sitting in
just,
a meeting and
yeah. Well, I think it's kind of like my student who did kind of run away from Thanksgiving dinner. He knew he was so overly triggered that it was going to be really impossible for him to kind of modulate his emotions at that moment. And he knew he just needed to get out of there. And I think, and we can't expect to be perfect either. We might think that we're okay, and we might think, oh, now I'm okay. And we might still have a regrettable emotional episode. Like we might kind of not be totally aware of where we are, and we think, oh no, I'll be able to do it differently this time. I've practiced, I've habituated to different ways of doing it, and then we still lose the plot, and that can totally happen. And so we have to also realize that it's a process, and sometimes we're going to make mistakes. But I think it's sort of the attitude too, a little bit, is like, does it really just feel like running away, or does it really feel like a wise thing to do to stop yourself from doing something that's, regrettable, But yeah, it's hard to judge sometimes, and we might get it wrong, and I think we just need to kind of accept that we might get it wrong sometimes. Yeah. What's with these planes? Does this happen every night? This is like so bizarre. This is like,
Something going on because traffic was
Yeah, traffic was terrible.
traffic was unbelievable. I don't know.
wow. I mean, I was just kind of going, have I been deaf for the last week and a half that I've been here? I haven't noticed this at all the entire time. Yeah, clearly. And that kind of hasn't happened the whole time I've been here. I'm like, what the heck? Sorry for the, I was just like, what's going on out there? Okay. Any other questions or comments about that? And then let's look at one more slide about how to work with our emotions. Then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and look at the 4 virtues of the heart, and we're going to do another meditation for that too. So moderating our emotional behaviors, develop emotionfulness. I'm not quite sure who coined this word. Really considering, being attentive, tuning into our emotional feelings, becoming aware of our triggers, identifying and weakening our own hot triggers for emotions. Learn about the bodily sensations that distinguish the different emotions. And in the long CEB, the 42-hour Cultivating Emotional Balance, we work with each of the 7 and trigger them and really note what sensations are present in our body. Because for a lot of people, that's the first clue that they're emotional, is some feeling in their body, right? So learning what those are. Develop impulse awareness. So even if we're already feeling emotional, becoming really aware of our impulse for an action to create the space and the choice there before we actually act. And this reminds me of a quote by Viktor Frankl, and it's something like, between impulse and an action, there's always a space, and within that space, there's choice. Something like that, so it's sort of like we don't always have to act, and kind of realizing we have an impulse to action doesn't mean it's automatic. So creating that space to create choice in that point. Becoming more observant of the emotional feelings of others. And so we looked at some of the faces of emotion. You can get good at reading the emotional responses of other people too, so that you know how they're feeling. And that's why I mentioned last week it's so scary being around Paul Ekman, because he's mapped out all the muscles in the face, and he'll be like, well, you've got a little 4 and a 23 going on there. So that means just like, get out of my head, But it's all just kind of written on our faces. And so we get much more attuned to that as we learn more about emotions. And also, applying our understanding of the emotional episode timeline to other people too. We can go, oh, they're in their selective filtering period right now. We all need a break. And then we might be able to deal with it later. Or, understanding what somebody else's triggers might be because of something going on in their life. I mean, you don't want to psychoanalyze other people, but sometimes it's really clear, oh, there they are again. My God, it's like World War III out there or something. And we can gain some understanding of like what it is for them. Again, not to psychoanalyze in a patronizing way, but sometimes it's just, it can give us more empathy and more compassion for other people's emotional experience too. So, refractory period, distorting the perception, understanding their situation. So even if we can't reappraise, even if we still feel our feelings are justified, we can interrupt our actions, control our voice and face, and resist the impulse to act. So it's really all about awareness and then transformation of our responses, and bringing a lot more awareness, looking at that emotional episode timeline. So any questions about this? Well, let's get up and take a quick break, and then we'll come back and we'll look at what we call the 4 virtues of the heart, known in our Buddhist practice as the 4 immeasurables, and then we'll do another short practice. In Cultivating Emotional Balance, there are many different meditation techniques. We haven't really had a chance in our little short course to do them, but I wanted to do a loving kindness practice when we come back. All right, take a break, 10 minutes. That's what Alan Wallace calls them, which I quite like. Okay, so let's look at this practice of what Alan Wallace, one of the founders of CEB or the developers of CEB, calls the 4 virtues of the heart. Like I said, in Buddhist practice, we call them the 4 immeasurables. How many of you are familiar with the 4 immeasurables from your Buddhist study? Okay, so quite a few of you, about half of you. So we'll look at them one by one, and then we'll do a practice. So the 4 virtues of the heart. The first one is loving kindness. And we define this in Buddhism as wishing others to have happiness. So loving kindness, very, kind of specific definition, wishing ourselves and others to have happiness. So we always have ourselves in there too. We don't leave ourselves out of the equation at all. So it's a wish for ourselves and others to have happiness. Now, for all of these 4 virtues of the heart, we have what we call a far enemy, which is like a direct opposite, and then the near enemy, which is kind of close but off base, right? So the direct opposite, what we call the far enemy of loving kindness, is hatred. Hatred towards others. Instead of wishing them to have happiness, we have hatred towards them. And then the near enemy, we say, is self-centered attachment. And that's more that somebody else's happiness, your happiness is dependent on their happiness, so you wish for them to be happy because somehow it'll make you happy. So it's really still all about you, right? So that's how we can get off base in our loving kindness practice. And you see this all the time, of people just kind of wanting like when we're trying to fix anybody who's sad or something, right? We often do that. Often we have so much discomfort with others, unpleasant moods or whatever they're going through. But it's really not so much about them. It's really all about like, oh my God, this makes me so uncomfortable. Please, quick, be happy again, because I can't handle it. I've done a lot of hospice work in the past, and hospice workers really understand this too with dying people, and really caution us as caregivers about over-medicating people for their pain. Because they say, you're really kind of over-medicating the person. They don't need that much, but it makes you so uncomfortable to see them in any kind of pain at all. You're giving a lot of morphine or something. You're doing it for yourself rather than really doing it for the other person. So there's a lot of different ways that this can manifest. Anytime the motivation is really kind of about you, the other person's happiness really is all about you're trying to make them happy because of your own discomfort around their unhappiness. Because sometimes the best thing that you can do is just kind of be there and just, in California we have this expression, hold the space. Which is a little bit like groovy. You probably don't hold the space in Boston, do you? Do you? Do you hold the space? Oh, you do. You hold the space. We had a sign maker come to... I live at this retreat center, and we had a sign maker come and redo all of our signs of this way to the meditation hall, this way to the office, this way to the retreat cabins. And then he painted all these signs that said, silent retreat, please hold the space. And I was like, oh my God, that's on a sign now. That's just too California. Anyway, but sometimes when other people are going through something, not to try and fix them all the time, right? I had another example. I was living in a Buddhist center, and I was asked to facilitate a support group for women with chronic illness. And, I don't have really any chronic illness apart from cyclic existence. I think at that point I was going through menopause. I don't know if I call that a chronic illness or not. Anyway, I'm like, okay, whatever, I'll do. And I found what the group was really about was for these women to talk about their experience in a supportive setting with everybody else, sharing that experience, because their family and friends was just too freaked out when they talked about their fear and their pain and what they were going through. And in this group, we could just kind of laugh and sort of have empathy around it. So that's kind of this thing about the self-centered attachment, how our loving kindness practice can get off base and become about us. And then obviously hatred is the opposite. And we say when we develop this loving kindness, it succeeds when it makes animosity subside. So it's the opposite. And we say in Buddhism, you can't have loving kindness and hatred in your mind towards the same object at the same time. They're completely contradictory. There's just no way, right? So we train in loving kindness practice, and we'll do one in a minute after we talk about the four. So any questions about that one, loving kindness? Okay, and now that you kind of know how it works, the second one is compassion, the second of the four virtues of the heart. And what do you think the far enemy of compassion is, the direct opposite of compassion? No? So the opposite, okay, let me define compassion, by the way. Compassion, the wish to relieve the suffering of others. So what would the opposite of the wish to relieve the suffering? Yeah, cruelty, right? The wish to harm, cruelty. And what do you think the near enemy, when our compassion gets just subtly off base? How can our compassion practice get kind of off base? Not in terms of the opposite of cruelty, but in terms of just not quite on point. Selfishness, in terms of what kind of selfishness do you think? That would be kind of more the opposite, though. It wouldn't be like if we're trying to develop compassion, but we get it kind of off. We get kind of off base. What do you think? Pity. Yeah, we say pity can be one way that our compassion, because it's sort of like, oh, you poor thing, I can't imagine ever being there. Like there isn't that equality there between it. Yeah, there are a couple of other flavors, but pity is one way we can get kind of off base. What else? Pity is one, and then there's another one. Chris, did you have an idea?
Yeah, I don't know the emotion, but doing it for your own ego gratification. So sort of, to relieve suffering, like you're getting something out of it.
Yeah, that's true too. Just that thing of again, it makes you feel worthy or something, like you're doing actions to relieve other suffering because it makes you feel good about yourself. You're the savior, you're the hero. Yeah. And in the back? And tell me more what you mean by that.
You are kind of in possession of the object of your empathy. It's not true compassion. You're trying to relieve the sufferer. You're just kind of empathizing with it in a possessive way.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting one, and it might relate to kind of the other flavor of the near enemy. We say it can lead to despair and overwhelm, right? So it's sort of like, instead of just the wish to relieve the suffering, we can get so overwhelmed in our wish even to relieve the suffering. So that kind of relates a little bit to the attachment, like it's too much, which then often can lead us to just shutting down completely, right? So it's like that sort of despair and overwhelm. Sometimes we talk about compassion burnout. Eve Ekman says it's really empathy burnout, which I think is an interesting distinction. She says our compassion actually can't burn out, but our empathy can burn out. I'm not quite sure about that. I need to give that some thought. But that's one flavor. So sort of the pity side and then the despair and overwhelm side are the way our compassion can get off base. Yeah.
Helping someone, like it's really, you have ulterior motive.
Yeah, and that's often the way it is too. Like our actions to help others. Yeah. It's somehow fulfilling some agenda, and that's one of the things in Buddhism. Some of you may have heard the teaching on the 8 worldly concerns, and like sometimes even we always say we check our motivation, even from acts that might look altruistic, we might do with not an altruistic motivation at all. It's so that people will look at us and say, oh, wow, what a bodhisattva. They're like so amazing. Or to get our name on the bronze plaque because we gave the donation. You know, there's so many ways like that we can get kind of off base. The effect might be positive for the person we're helping. We might still really be able to help. But we would say from our side, not so much benefit because there wasn't really any kind of altruistic motivation there. Yeah. And then we say compassion succeeds when cruelty subsides, so when the opposite of it subsides. So let's look at that. So compassion, the far enemy, cruelty, despair or overwhelm on the one hand, pity on the other hand, succeeds when cruelty subsides. And then the third one is empathetic joy, taking delight in others' happiness. This is one that our teacher Lama Zopa Rinpoche really emphasizes a lot. He calls it rejoyfulness, like rejoicing in others' happiness. And so the far enemy would be envy and jealousy of their happiness, right? That would be kind of the total opposite, is instead of being happy in somebody else's happiness, you're jealous of their happiness or envious of their happiness. Also cynicism. You're kind of like somebody else is really happy, they just succeeded in something, they got what they wanted, whatever it may be, and you're just sort of like cynical about it. You're just like, oh, well, yeah, whatever, you know, it's not really gonna work to give you, you know, you're just not sincerely really happy about their happiness. And then the near enemy, and this one's kind of tricky, fixation on hedonic pleasure. So that means, that's kind of a fancy way of saying, you're just focused on their fleeting sensory pleasures, and you're not really rejoicing in a deeper level of happiness, a deeper level of well-being. You're just really happy when they get a new car, but then they get a job that they feel like is really meaningful, that they've been wanting for a while. You could care less about that. You're just fixated on, you know, the glittery kind of sense pleasure level of happiness and not the deeper happiness. And it succeeds when there's an uplifting appreciation of virtue. There's a researcher that I really like, I mentioned last week, his name is Jonathan Haidt, and he coined this word for one of the enjoyable emotions that he calls elevation. And he said, elevation is the emotion we have when you see someone else doing something virtuous, especially when it's unexpected. And I always think the internet is full of these things, like the Good News Network and Upworthy and all of these things that we can get the emotion of elevation. And it's a very, very specific feeling that we get when you see, you know, the firefighters go into the mud and pull out the dog that's stuck, and, you know, like that. And you just kind of like, you know, it's this uplift, and he calls it elevation. So you've just learned a new emotional word tonight, the emotion of elevation. And it sort of relates to that rejoicing, because I think we get the emotion of elevation when we rejoice in others' virtues, especially. And in Buddhism, we say we're happy about their happiness, but especially in Tibetan Buddhism, we emphasize being happy in others' virtues. That's what's really, and that's that deeper level, because we know then they're creating the cause for even more happiness by doing something virtuous. So that's empathetic joy. Any questions about compassion or empathetic joy? Yeah, Chris.
Is there a near enemy in terms of, like, let's say you have a son or daughter or spouse, and you see them almost as an object, and so when they do something, or like, you know, when a parent sees a kid go to college, and it's more like, you know, them living their life to them.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. That would be interesting too. I'd have to give it some thought in terms of like, how would that relate to the kind of the four virtues of the heart? But yeah, that's another thing you see is like parents living vicariously through their, you know, that would be a lot of, I think that would be the attachment that's the near enemy of the loving kindness. Because like, instead of really wishing for their happiness, you want them to have fulfill your agenda so you'll really be happy. I mean, just talking it through to myself right now, I think that would be the one that relates to the most. Is it's still that self-centered attachment of, oh, if my son becomes a doctor or my daughter becomes a lawyer, the neighbors will be impressed and I'll, be taken care of in my old age and blah, 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 blah. Whether they want to be a doctor or lawyer at all, that's kind of not on the radar. So it's really still all about your own agenda. I think that might relate more to that one. Yeah, that's an interesting one that, I think we need to, as parents, purify our motivation for our children's happiness and make sure it's fulfilling their agenda and not ours for them. Yeah, good.
Are all of these expected to be, or ideally, would you put the word unconditional in front of it?
Yeah, and that's part of it. Like from Buddhist frame of reference, we call them immeasurable. And the reason we use the word immeasurable, which is kind of a funny word, we say it's immeasurable in terms of the object. So we say all beings without exception. And then it's immeasurable in terms of the scope of our own intensity of that quality. So kind of both, unconditional in terms of the object and also sort of completely unconditional in terms of just our own capacity to hold that emotion, which obviously is a big ask, but that's why there's so many meditation techniques to develop these qualities, because we say that we just, develop them, grow them, grow them, grow them, and especially in the Tibetan Buddhist practices where we emphasize so much loving kindness and compassion and bodhicitta, this wish to get enlightened for the benefit of all. This is so fundamental to those practices. And we say, eventually we can develop it so it is that level of unconditionality, for sure. Yeah, and that,
Kind of interesting. The near enemy to me on all of them are. It's almost like that's like the sticking. Like I look at the Western world and I think that those are the sticking points.
yeah,
Like despair and overwhelm. Like what like our inability to really talk about chronic illness.
yeah,
And death process. It's just like a lot of people just like freeze up and they just
exactly.
they don't know what to do. They just get really sad and they walk away. Like they don't know how to express compassion.
Yeah, that's right.
Or with the other one in the near enemy, I can't remember exactly what it was, but the kindness, hatred.
Yeah.
Hatred is such. It's almost like today. It's like that's on the mainstream. That's
Oh, yeah.
seeing propaganda.
Yeah.
It's like hate propaganda. It's like, and we don't know how to roll back from that. So it's really interesting to see all. Like these are the perfection qualities here, and how far away.
Oh, absolutely. And it goes, and they say, I mean, in Buddhist terms, they say that we're living in the degenerate age where all of the, disturbing emotions and mental afflictions are just proliferating like mad. And you can see it. I mean, it's just like, whoa, all you have to do is like tune into the news and things. So they say, when we're trying to do these practices and develop these qualities, it's harder than it has been in the past to develop them because it's so going against the stream of the degenerate age. But the virtue we get from even trying is like astronomical. So they say, even though it's harder to develop these qualities, just the virtue we get from even trying is huge, just because it's so contrary to kind of the flavor of where people are coming from these days. And I take a lot of refuge in that, because I'm kind of like, oh my God, I've done all these long retreats. I mean, in the time of Lord Buddha, people were getting these deep realizations after, listening to one 4-line stanza of, then, Shariputra got the direct realization of emptiness. And I'm like, oh my God, But then when I think, well, wow, like all the effort that I am making is really counts for a lot, because boy, oh boy, is it ever going against the stream, of kind of the flavor of the world. I mean, I don't even want to start with politics, but I'm just kind of thinking, whatever happened to talking about anything positive and values and policies and what's going to help, rather than just attacking each other, just like, I mean, God, it's like unbelievable. And I'm going, am I naive and forgetful that I thought that politics used to be a little bit more about what people were going to do to help the country, and not just trying to prove that each other was just the biggest jerk of all and tearing each other down. I mean, that's just an example of that kind of stuff. It's just so ugly. So, I think what we're trying to do, is very, and it is interesting, like you say, to look at this list and just go, yep, oh yeah, yep, near enemy, far enemy, near enemy, far enemy, near enemy, far enemy. So that trying to develop these qualities is really contrary to that, yeah.
And a long time, like when I first started taking the Buddhist class, and I remember Sean saying, this is the degenerate age, and I'm like, what, middle age is pretty bad. What's
Yeah,
wrong
right,
with our-
right,
what's
right.
wrong with our age? But now that I see how
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
so
yeah.
self-absorbed and everything, I see that, the way that we were so attached.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's easy to kind of go back and forth. I'm reading this book right now by Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. I don't know if anybody's heard of this book, about how the world is getting less violent. And then he goes into history, and then I'm in the chapter right now talking about the rights revolution, of this human rights revolution, and the transatlantic slave trade stopped, and women, and, gay people, and everybody, civil rights, and all of this. So there's that, and then there's the, so it's interesting. There's ways of looking at it, I think, from both angles, but for sure we can see the proliferation of some of these really nasty mental afflictions out there, that's for sure. And kind of public discourse seems to be getting much more gnarly. It really feels that way. There's just not many standards left anymore of like how you're talking about other people in public. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the last of the four is equanimity. And you've probably run into this, those of you who've studied Buddhism before, and it's really overcoming our strong partiality. We say that, ordinarily we want all the good stuff to happen to us and our friends. The people that we don't know at all, we kind of could care less what happens to them. And then the people that we call enemy, or if enemy seems like too strong of a word, just the people that we dislike, we kind of get off a little bit when icky stuff happens to them. They're having a bitter divorce, and there's part of us that takes joy. It's that Schadenfreude thing that we were talking about before, of like, the people we dislike go through misfortune. So obviously, if we're trying to develop unconditional, universal loving kindness and compassion for people, we got to get over that thing of that strong partiality. So we say, sometimes equanimity comes at the end of the list. Sometimes it becomes at the beginning of the list, because it's a little bit like leveling the playing field, right? On that level playing field, then we can build up loving kindness and compassion, but we work on overcoming that strong partiality. So the far enemy is the partiality that manifests as attachment and aversion. So those are the two extremes: strong liking that's all about us, and strong disliking that's all about us. And then the near enemy is indifference. So equanimity and overcoming partiality does not mean developing equal indifference for all beings, right? That's how it can get off base if we think, oh, I'm not allowed to care about anyone. And this is kind of a Buddhist rumor. Like, if you're a good Buddhist, you can't really have friends because that's attachment. And of course, you're not supposed to dislike people. So everybody just becomes this neutral, blah, indifferent, objects of our indifference. And that's absolutely off base, right? And that's not what our equanimity practice. So it exceeds when attachment and aversion towards others subsides. Okay. So So I want to show the interrelationship between these four, which is very cool, but let's do a little practice. And for this practice, I want you to begin in pairs. So pick a partner and sit facing your partner. So you might want to pick somebody. Don't worry, it's not going to be scary. It's going to be okay. Everybody's like, pick a partner. And do we have an even number? Do you want to partner with somebody if we need an extra? Oh, we can have 3. Are you sure? Yeah? Okay. All right. So you ready? Everybody partnered or tripleted? All right. Okay. So first, we'll begin as we usually begin our practice, just with our eyes closed, and just take a few minutes to just settle into your body, observing the sensations in your body. And if you feel yourself feeling any kind of tension, just invite yourself to just relax and release with each exhalation, and just take a couple of minutes to just kind of ground yourself, be there in your body with your breath. And now begin to sense that there's another person sitting in front of you who's also feeling sensations. Just begin to sense the presence of another person sitting in front of you. And now gently blink your eyes open and begin to make eye contact with this person. And as you become aware of this person, recognize that this person is a fellow human being, just like me. This person has a body and mind just like me. This person has sensations, feelings, thoughts, and emotions, just like me. This person has at some point been sad, disappointed, angry, hurt, or confused, just like me. This person has in his or her life experienced physical and emotional pain and suffering, just like me. This person wishes to be free from pain and suffering, just like me. This person wishes to be safe, healthy, and loved, just like me. This person wishes to be happy, just like me. And now close your eyes and continue to maintain this person's presence in mind. Again, recognizing this is a person who cares to be happy, just like me. And with this sense of connection and this heartfelt concern, breathe out and bring forth the kind wish. May you be truly happy and well. As you breathe out, may you be happy and well. And now bring to mind a loved one or a dear friend and invoke that person's presence in your mind by way of a mental image or a felt sense of that person's presence. Someone for whom you naturally feel strong feelings of loving kindness, of wishing them to be happy. And while holding this person in mind, take a moment to feel with them, acknowledging them as a living being who cares to be loved, cares to be happy. And keeping this connection in mind with a heartfelt concern, breathe out the kind-hearted wish, may you be truly happy and well. extending kindness out to this person with each exhalation. May you be happy. May you be well. And then bring yourself to mind. Take a moment to feel into yourself today and acknowledge that you too are a living being who cares to be happy, who cares to be well. And while feeling into yourself in this way, with a heartfelt concern, breathe out the kind wish to yourself. May I be truly happy and well. And then let's dedicate the goodness of this practice towards the realization of our highest potential so that we may serve the greatest welfare of all living beings. Well, that was nice. Any comments or experiences with that one?
I kept thinking at the beginning, sorry, I was laughing because I remember learning about, I don't know, in emotion researchers, I forget whether it was like Gottman or Ekman or that by staring into somebody's eyes for a minute straight or 2 minutes straight, you fall in love with them. So I was thinking to myself, I'm gonna fall in love with you.
Right.
I'm like, I gotta look at Mimi. I'm like, wait a minute, I can't look at her too long.
Yeah.
I feel my head.
That was Gottman. That's Gottman, yeah.
So I said, I have to get that out of my, and I was able to get it out of my head after a little while. And really have compassion.
I'm very vulnerable. I think insulted that, so.
But it's amazing, isn't it, to do this and like you can really, I mean, laughter is always the real enemy of this practice, obviously. I mean, believe it or not, I did this in a room of 120 prison inmates and I had them do this practice, you know, and there was a fair amount of giggling in the beginning. And then at the end, it was just like with you guys, you could have heard a pin drop, you know, it was just amazing actually for them. And especially in that environment of so much violence and distrust, to do that, it's super transformative. Yeah.
No, I was going to say that we do this practice in yoga teacher training.
Oh, do you?
That's why I was
Yeah, you're used to doing it. Oh, nice.
Very close, one in front of the other, and we do it for a few minutes. And at the
Yeah.
beginning, it's hard. Everybody
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah.
shy, but after a while, it's just lovely.
Yeah, nice,
So
nice. Yeah.
People are not used to look at each other in a open, kind of
Yeah.
sincere, I put it out there kind of way.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
you're, I guess, vulnerable, and people always kind of protect themselves.
That's right. That's right. So,
It's like saying, at some point, plus we're trees with a different dynamic, but I was looking at other people, and it's like, well, if other people could, if we everywhere could look at people
yeah.
like truly, sincerely looking at the people, it would make a lot of difference. I was thinking about that, just looking at the entire crowd.
Right, right, and just making that personal connection. I mean, they say that often, like we were talking about the overwhelm that you can feel, and then they say, when you can connect with like a real person, you often don't feel the overwhelm because that feeling just comes up. It's sort of like when it's the faceless Syrian refugees or something, then it's easy to just go like, oh my God, and that's why images of like the little boy, in the ambulance are so powerful, because then it puts a face to the suffering in a way that does open our heart and kind of overcome that, even though we're not looking him in the eyes like in real life, but still, like when you put a face to that. And that's why those images, I think, are so powerful, because it kind of overcomes our resistance, because you can't turn away. Like there's a human being, like all of a sudden it's like super real,
The sincere eye to eye is like,
It's powerful, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Anybody else have anything? Yeah, in the back.
In our daily lives, we're in ourself. And you know what I mean by
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
We think we are ourselves.
Right.
We're very separate. We're very individual.
Yeah.
This is a very good meditation in terms of
Mm.
it's taking you out of that self
Mm.
and it's connecting you to the oneness of all of
Yeah.
us. But even the words that go along with that,
Yeah.
it's taking away that separation that we sometimes feel that am I the only person in the world that feels this? And even the words you used, they're really expressing that we are all one.
Yeah.
We're also the same.
Yeah.
We all have that shared
Have those experiences, yeah. And I think we're talking about, the world these days, and it's just, as my mother would say, going to hell in a handbasket, and it was like, going to hell in a handbasket? What an image. That is like some expression we used to say. It's just like it's just all falling apart kind of thing, it's just this degenerate age. But you really think about how I gave a talk the other day about this link between the emotion of awe and altruism, like how feeling the emotion of awe leads to altruism, and then connecting it to how little, a lot of times we feel awe in nature, or we feel some feeling of awe, like that elevation when we see people doing things of virtue. If we're so self-absorbed and just in front of our phone, on our phone or email all the time, we're like cheating ourselves of that broader experience, and just the experience of connecting face to face with FaceTime. Like, that's so ridiculous. I mean, I do that kind of thing. I do Skype because half my friends are halfway around the world, but like, we don't have that face to face interaction that really leads to empathy and altruism, because it's a real human being. Like, it's so easy for us to kind of keep a separation because we've got our electronic device in between us and all other people. And you really kind of look at the effects of that on people. I mean, it's got a lot of ramifications in terms of things like empathy and altruism, that we're not connecting. It reminded me of something that I try and do, and I think I read this somewhere, and homeless people often say the hardest part about being homeless isn't like living on the sidewalk and not having enough to eat. It's that nobody ever looks them in the eye, like all day long, even if somebody puts change in the cup. And so they say that's the hardest part. And so I always try, when I'm like in public, to really connect and talk to homeless people, because, hearing that just, I don't exist, I'm just invisible to people, is like emotionally kind of the hardest thing. And it doesn't take much to just connect, face to face and eye to eye for a moment. So really looking at how powerful that can be from just our little experience here with people that we, maybe know, maybe you were paired up with somebody that you already know, maybe not, but, in the so-called kind of safe environment, and just how powerful that is. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
had an experience just the other day about walking the lake in the area I live in, and it was somebody that remembered me being kind to him. He said, last time you saw me, I was homeless. I was out for half an
Oh,
hour, and things have turned around, and
wow.
people have helped him, but like he remembered me talking to him,
Yeah.
like you said, looking, and even sometimes they want to, how people give in to them.
Yeah.
Being on the train where another homeless person was trying so hard to give like a beaded necklace to people.
Oh,
So I just accepted it and
right.
said thank you, and that made him happy, because like I never thought of it that sometimes they
Yeah.
want to give
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
little trinket thing they have in the little booklet.
Yeah.
I never realized that.
Oh,
So I agree, that makes a huge difference. It
yeah.
just confirmed it the other day when that person remembered me about a year or so ago.
Yeah.
Said,
Wow.
yeah, so.
Yeah, it makes an impact. It really does make an impact. That story of them wanting to give, a friend of mine who's a monk, British monk, he loved to do a practice that's traditional in Southeast Asia, and he would do it in India, of going around with a begging bowl barefoot, because that's the way the monks in Southeast Asian Buddhist countries live. And he was just like, I'm just going to do it in India, and we'll see how it works out. And one day, he went to Bodh Gaya, where back in those days they've sort of like now have all these gates and things, but it used to be filled with beggars, and mostly people with leprosy, missing body parts, didn't have anything at all. And I don't even know how it occurred to him, but I think he was just, one of the things for going on alms round with your begging bowl is you don't discriminate at all. You just kind of stand there and anybody puts in. So he's walking and he's like, well, why am I walking past the beggars? They're people too. So he just stood there, and the way you go on alms, you just lower your eyes. You don't like ask for anything. You don't even thank anybody for what they put in. And he realized the beggars, took them a while to figure out what he was doing. And then they came and put all these things in his bowl that they had. And he said, they were so empowered by giving and practicing generosity, because they were always, sitting there calling out to people passing by to give them things. And then all of a sudden they sort of straightened up and they're like, oh, and they all came and put, and they hardly had anything, but each one of them came and offered something into his bowl. And it was just like, wow. I mean, I wish I'd been there. I just heard the story and it was so incredible to hear. But it's yeah. So same kind of thing, just that. Yeah, and like, hey, I can be generous too. Like, I'm a human being. I'm not always just on the receiving end. Like, I can actually give something too. Yeah.
One thing that, of course, here it's a little bit more intense when you look at someone in the eyes, but when you walk around in public and stuff like that, people sometimes cross your eyes and they just avert your
Yeah.
stare.
Yeah.
And very often, I give a smile, but a lot of people,
I know. It's weird. They think you're a weirdo. Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
A lot of people are afraid to smile at
Yeah.
like, hey. And it's kind of, I don't know why people are afraid of giving a smile to, and like someone mentioned, it's weird,
Right.
you sit next to someone sometime day after day at the train station. I don't take the train, but
Yeah.
and everyone's on their
Right.
next to each
You're
other.
so awkward and embarrassed.
You see
Yeah.
the same person every day, but you don't know them. They're a stranger, and you don't even say hello. Or
Yeah.
and it's kind of funny because you can't know each other to a certain degree.
Right. I mean, you recognize this person. Like, would it be so terrible to just say, hey, I see you every day. What's your name? How's it going?
Just a smile anyway.
Yeah.
You're weirder when you give a smile.
I know. Well, try doing it in this outfit. Just like, oh my God. It's either a lot easier or a lot harder. It's never just sort of the same. It's either like they're more into it or not at all. Yeah. All right, one more tiny thing I wanted to do because it's just so cool. There is a way, we've been looking at these near enemies of the four virtues of the heart, like how we can just get slightly off balance. And there's a way that each one of the four corrects for the near enemies of the other ones. This will become clear in the next slide. So, for example, if our loving kindness practice succumbs to self-centered attachment, meditate on equanimity, because that's the antidote to strong partiality. So if our loving kindness practice is getting off base, meditate on equanimity to correct for that self-centered attachment. If compassion succumbs to despair, meditate on empathetic joy. Everybody has something that makes them happy. And so if you're focused on the suffering Syrian refugees, there's something, they've got relationships with each other. They have strong family ties. I was in India one time, and I was there for quite a while in Bodh Gaya, and I'd made friends with the rickshaw driver, this one rickshaw driver, and he invited me to his house for lunch, which was like a big deal, having the Western nun come for lunch. And the whole family's there, and the grandmother, and they're serving, and they've made this elaborate, like, God knows, I felt like I'm taking the food out of the children's mouths, because they have to feed the fat Western nuns. So there I am, and and then they start asking me questions, and they didn't really know much about being a nun. So they're like, so madam, are you married? No, not married, So, do you have children? And I was like, no children. And they're starting to look pretty concerned by now. And I'm in this like one, hut with the dirt floor, and they're like, parents? No, both my parents have passed away. Now they're alarmed, like they're feeling really sorry for me by now, and they're kind of like really digging aunts, uncles, grandparents, anything. And I'm kind of like, wow, how interesting. Like, I'm sitting in this hut, and even as a nun, I have more than they have, like, for a year in my, bag. But I'm the object of pity because they have these, like, warm, intense relationship. And then I started feeling sorry for myself, It's just like, God, it's so pathetic. I have no relatives at all, But it's interesting. So it's like that, when you start to feel that despair. I mean, I think of that example all the time because it would be so easy for me to just be all, this poor family, like whatever the father makes that day, pulling, the rickshaw, buys the food for the family that day. But from their perspective, I'm the poverty-stricken one, like totally. And I was really feeling that way by the end of lunch, too. I was like, thanks for lunch and not much else. No, not really. It was fine. But, like that. So empathetic joy kind of corrects for that despair. And then when empathetic joy succumbs to fixation on the sort of worldly pleasures that the person's having, tune into that deeper sense of loving kindness that really wants them to have that genuine, lasting happiness, not just the shiny new car, the ice cream cone, or whatever it is, but a deeper level of happiness. And then if equanimity succumbs to aloof indifference, meditate on compassion. So this is a cool way that the four virtues of the heart interrelate to each other. And I would teach this a lot, and I would always say, I'm super into diagrams, and I'd always say, I have yet to really come up with a good diagram of this interrelationship. And then once I was teaching, and this one student was kind of doodling, and I was just like, God, how dare she doodle on, I'm teaching the Holy Dharma. And then at the end of the class, she presented me with the diagram of how they relate to each other. So you can see at the top, I'm not sure how much you can see, it's not so dark. So loving kindness, so the red arrow is for all of these is the near enemies. And then the blue arrow is like how they correct for each other. So at the end of class, she presented me with the diagram, and she was so proud that she got it into a diagram. And I'm like, this is awesome, because then it just shows that interrelationship. And then she was even more proud when I told her that the diagram ended up in the Cultivating Emotional Balance teacher training manual. And then she was really stoked. So it's like that for each of them, how it gets off base, and then how you apply the other one. So I just think that's so cool. Well, somebody's going to take a picture. No, it's actually in your, on the Kurukulla website is the PDF of the slideshow. So you can go on there, right? Is it on the Kurukulla website? Yeah, it should be there.
Otherwise, email me maybe, or everyone can email me.
Yeah, because I saved the whole slideshow as a PDF, so you should have, you'd be able to have all the slides. Of this slideshow, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's gonna be hard to
No, that's
stop it and.
yeah, but that's why I put the PDF along with, so that people could listen to the audio and then have the, or listen to the video and then actually have the slides kind of in the PDF. Yeah, any questions about that? Isn't that cool? I just love that, you know, I just think that's so.
Chinese elements, one cancels the other.
Yeah, exactly, right, how they correct for each other, yeah. All right, well, that's it for our short intro to cultivating emotional balance. Like I said, there's a 42 hours. I just kind of picked out some bits and pieces that I thought would be hopefully helpful to you. And yeah, so hopefully there's some things that I've presented, and really looking at that emotional episode timeline and some of these ways of kind of bringing more awareness and more choice to our emotional episodes. So thank you all for your attention and your, yeah, coming to class. Great. All right. Oh. Thank you.
very much looking forward to the rest of the weekend
Thank you.
and to visit next week.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Oh,
That
thank
was
you.
amazing. It was
Oh,
just like,
great.
wow,
Thank
this is so
you.
weird.
Oh,